In the year 1237, the Masons' Lodge stood beside the rising Cathedral of Salisbury, where limestone dust hung golden in the autumn air, and the sound of mallet on chisel marked the slow passage of hours. Good evening. I am grateful you are here tonight. Tonight's story will carry us to a Mason's Lodge in southern England, where we will follow Thomas through his careful work on the cathedral's newest stones. Let yourself settle in, get comfortable, and know that there is nowhere else you need to be. This story will be here, unfolding slowly for as long as you need. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands and graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, ran his palm across the limestone block before him. The surface held the coolness of the earth it had come from, smooth in some places, rough in others where the quarry marks still showed. Morning light filtered through the open sides of the lodge, casting long shadows across workbenches worn smooth by decades of use. The scent of limestone dust mingled with wood shavings, and the faint, green smell of the water meadows beyond. He had marked the stone the previous afternoon, careful lines scored into the pale surface showing where each cut would fall. The cathedral chapter had approved the corbel design weeks ago, a simple capital with leaf patterns that would support one of the nave's smaller arches. Nothing elaborate, nothing that would draw the eye upward in distraction during prayers, but honest work that would hold its weight for centuries. Thomas appreciated that kind of labor, the way it asked for patience rather than speed, precision rather than flourish. The iron mallet rested comfortably in his right hand, its wooden handle worn to fit his grip exactly. He positioned the chisel against the first guideline, feeling the subtle give of metal edge against stone. The first tap sent a small chip falling to the floor, where it joined countless others scattered across the packed earth. Another tap, then another, each one deliberate, each one removing only what needed to go. The rhythm settled into his bones the way it always did, becoming less a conscious action and more a kind of meditation. Breath and strike, breath and strike, the lodge filling with the patient music of stone being shaped. Thomas paused to brush dust from the surface, revealing the slight depression his work had created. The leaf pattern was beginning to emerge, though it would take hours more before its full form became clear. He had carved this particular design many times before, knew exactly how deep each curve needed to go, where the shadows would fall when the corbel finally sat in its place high above the cathedral floor. His hands knew the work even when his mind wandered, following the grooves and ridges the way water follows its channel. The lodge around him held the comfortable clutter of active work. Other stones waited on benches, some freshly delivered from the quarry with their rough faces still bearing the marks of wedges and picks, others nearly finished, needing only final smoothing before installation. Templates hung on pegs along the walls, thin wooden patterns that ensured each piece matched the master mason's design. Buckets of water stood ready for wetting the stones, making them easier to work. The whole space smelled of earth and effort, of materials being transformed through steady attention. A robin had built its nest in the rafters the previous spring, and though the bird had long since moved on, Thomas still glanced up occasionally at the small cup of mud and grass. The presence of that nest, made with such care in the midst of human labor, pleased him in a way he rarely tried to put into words. It seemed right that the lodge should shelter both the making of sacred architecture and the simpler, older work of birds preparing for their young. By mid-morning, the first leaf of the corbel had taken clear shape. Thomas set down his tools and stepped back, tilting his head to examine the curve from different angles. The light had shifted since he began, now falling more directly through the eastern opening, and he could see where the stone would catch and hold brightness once it sat in place. Satisfied, he moved to the water bucket, dipping his hands to wash away the accumulated dust. The water ran milky white, carrying away limestone powder that settled at the bottom of the wooden pail. His apprentice, young William, 14 years old with eager eyes and hands still learning their strength, had arrived at the lodge shortly after dawn to prepare the day's materials. The boy worked quietly at the far end, using a broad wooden plane to smooth a length of oak that would become part of the scaffolding. The sound of the plane added its own voice to the lodge's symphony, a softer whisper beneath the sharper notes of metal on stone. Thomas watched him for a moment, noting the way William braced his weight properly, the way his strokes followed the grain without forcing. Good instincts, those. They would serve him well in the years ahead. Thomas returned to his stone, but this time he selected a finer chisel, one meant for detail work rather than rough shaping. The second leaf needed to mirror the first, and he traced its outline lightly before beginning the actual cutting. The morning had warmed enough that he had rolled his wool sleeves to his elbows, and the air moving through the lodge carried the scent of ripening apples from the orchard beyond the cathedral close. Somewhere in the distance, the bells of the cathedral marked the hour of terce, their bronze voices rolling across stone and timber and open sky. The rhythm of work carried Thomas through the morning hours, each tap of mallet against chisel removing another small fragment of stone. The second leaf grew alongside the first, its veins and curves emerging from the limestone with the same patience that had shaped its companion. He worked without hurry, letting his hands follow the pattern they had learned through years of repetition, the kind of knowledge that lived in muscle and bone rather than conscious thought. William had finished smoothing the oak beam and now swept the floor of the lodge, gathering wood shavings and stone chips into neat piles near the door. The boy moved with careful attention, making sure his broom did not disturb the templates hanging on their pegs or scatter dust across stones that waited for finishing work. Thomas appreciated that carefulness, the way William understood that a clean workspace allowed for clearer thinking, for hands that found their tools without searching. The apprentice hummed softly as he worked, a tune Thomas recognized from Sunday Mass, and the sound blended pleasantly with the scrape of bristles against packed earth. The corbel's third leaf began to take form as the sun climbed higher. Thomas paused frequently to check his progress, running his fingertips across the carved surface to feel what his eyes could not always see, the subtle transitions between leaf and stem, the way each curve connected to the next. Stone spoke through touch as much as sight, revealing its grain and hidden flaws, telling him where it would accept his chisel willingly and where it might crack if pressed too hard. This particular limestone had proven cooperative, its texture even, and its color a warm cream that would catch the cathedral's interior light beautifully. By the time the bells rang for sext marking midday, Thomas had completed the basic carving of all 3 leaves. He set his tools aside and stretched, feeling the pleasant ache in his shoulders that came from hours of focused labor. William had already laid out their midday meal on a plank supported by 2 sawhorses, bread from the baker near the cathedral gate, hard cheese from the dairy, and ale in earthenware cups that sweated slightly in the warm afternoon air. They ate in comfortable silence, seated on blocks of finished stone, watching the shadows shift across the lodge floor. The bread was dense and satisfying, made from rye and wheat mixed together, its crust dark and crackling. Thomas chewed slowly, letting the simple flavors ground him after the morning's concentration. The cheese had a sharpness that cleared the stone dust from his throat, and the ale was cool despite the day's warmth, drawn fresh that morning from the cellar beneath the bakehouse. William ate with the appetite of youth, tearing into his portion with an enthusiasm that made Thomas smile quietly. After the meal, Thomas did not return immediately to the corbel. Instead, he walked to the far end of the lodge where several finished pieces waited for installation. Among them sat a pier base he had completed the previous week, its moldings crisp and clean, its proportions matching exactly the template the master mason had approved. He ran his hand along its edge, checking that no chips had marred the surface during handling. The stone felt solid and true, ready to bear the weight of the column that would rise above it, ready to stand for generations beyond counting. The afternoon light had a different quality than the morning's brightness, softer, more golden, casting longer shadows that emphasized the depth of carved details. Thomas returned to his corbel with a set of rasps, tools designed for smoothing rather than cutting, for refining what the chisel had begun. He worked over each leaf systematically, erasing the small ridges left by his chisels, bringing the surface to an evenness that would feel pleasant to any hand that might touch it in years to come. The rasp made a whispering sound as it moved across the limestone, a gentler voice than the mallet's percussion. Dust drifted down in fine clouds, settling on Thomas's forearms and the leather apron he wore to protect his tunic. The work required less strength than the earlier carving but more attention to detail, as each stroke of the rasp changed the play of light across the stone's surface. He paused often to blow away the accumulated dust, revealing what he had accomplished, adjusting his pressure and angle as needed. William had taken up his own project now, practicing cuts on a piece of waste stone. The boy worked with determined concentration, his tongue visible between his teeth as he focused on keeping his chisel perpendicular to the surface. Thomas watched him from the corner of his eye, nodding when to offer guidance and when to let the apprentice learn through his own mistakes. There was a time for correction and a time for discovery, and knowing which formed part of the master's duty. The afternoon proceeded with the same unhurried pace as the morning. Thomas finished smoothing the leaves and moved on to the areas between them, the spaces that would catch shadow and create depth when the corbel sat in place. These portions required careful judgment. Too shallow and the design would appear flat, too deep, and it would create harsh lines that disrupted the eye's peaceful movement across the stone. He worked by feel as much as sight, his fingertips reading the surface, telling him where more material needed removal and where he had reached the proper depth. A breeze moved through the lodge, carrying the scent of the water meadows and stirring the sawdust on the floor into small spirals. The season was turning toward autumn, though the days remained warm. Soon the light would begin to fail earlier, and they would need to adjust their working hours to match the sun's shorter journey across the sky. But today still held the fullness of late summer, the abundance of long afternoons and clear skies. Thomas set aside the rasps and selected a smooth stone, one kept specifically for final polishing. He dampened it with water from his bucket and began working over the corbel's surface in circular motions, bringing up a subtle sheen that would glow softly in the cathedral's interior light. The polishing required patience. Too much pressure would scratch rather than smooth. Too little would accomplish nothing. He fell into the rhythm of it, circular motion after circular motion, watching the stone gradually reveal its truest character. The polishing stone moved across the corbel's surface in patient circles, each pass bringing a deeper luster to the limestone. Water darkened the carved leaves to the color of honey, and Thomas could see more clearly now how the light would play across them when the piece finally rested high in the cathedral nave. The dampness released a mineral scent from the stone, clean and ancient. The smell of earth compressed over ages into this workable material that accepted his tools and his intention with equal grace. William had abandoned his practice stone and now stood watching his master work, observing the circular motion, the way Thomas's pressure remained constant throughout each sweep. The boy said nothing, understanding that some lessons came through observation rather than explanation, through watching hands that knew their craft so thoroughly that they moved almost independently of conscious thought. Thomas acknowledged the attention with a small nod, continuing his work without pause, letting the apprentice see how patience compounded into excellence. By the time the bells rang for none, the mid-afternoon prayer, the corbel had begun to show its finished quality. Thomas set down his polishing stone and stepped back, examining the piece from several angles. The 3 leaves curved outward with balanced grace, their veins and edges catching light in ways that would guide the eye upward along the arch they would support. The spaces between held shadow without darkness, depth without harshness. He felt the quiet satisfaction that came with work done properly, with a piece that would serve its purpose faithfully for longer than any life that might see it placed. He cleaned his hands again in the water bucket, then dried them on a length of linen kept for that purpose. The afternoon had grown warmer, and the shade of the lodge felt pleasant after the sun's direct attention. Thomas moved to the bench where several other finished pieces waited, checking each one in turn. A simple molding for a window frame, 2 carved bosses meant for vault intersections, a length of decorative string course that would run along the exterior wall. All solid work, all ready for the master mason's inspection and approval. William had returned to sweeping, gathering the day's accumulation of dust and chips into manageable piles. The boy worked with steady attention, making sure the floor would be clean for tomorrow's labor. Thomas appreciated that dedication to the small tasks, the understanding that excellence lived as much in preparation and cleanup as in the visible work itself. A mason who kept his tools sharp and his workspace orderly produced better work than one who neglected these foundations, however skilled his hands might be. Thomas walked to the lodge's eastern opening and stood looking out across the cathedral close. The great church rose before him, its walls climbing steadily toward the sky, scaffolding clinging to its sides like wooden ivy. Masons worked on the upper levels, their figures small with distance, and even from here he could hear the faint sounds of their labor, mallets striking, voices calling measurements, the creak of rope and pulley as stones rose to their appointed places. The building had been growing for years now, would continue growing for years more, and Thomas felt honored to contribute his portion to that patient accumulation. The afternoon light slanted across the cathedral's pale stone, emphasizing every detail of the work already completed. Thomas could identify pieces he had carved years ago, capitals and moldings that had become permanent parts of the structure. His labor transformed into something larger than himself. There was comfort in that transformation, in knowing that his hands had shaped materials that would outlast him by centuries, that would hold their forms long after his name had been forgotten. He turned back to the lodge and began organizing his tools for the next day's work. Each chisel went into its proper place in the wooden case he had built for them, arranged by size and purpose so his hands would find what they needed without searching. The mallets hung on pegs, their handles worn smooth by use. The rasps and files occupied their own section, kept separate from the cutting tools. Everything in its place, everything ready for morning. William finished his sweeping and began dampening the floor with water from a bucket, laying the dust that remained. The moisture brought out the earth's darker color and released a smell like rain on dry ground, fresh and settling. Thomas watched the boy work, nodding his thoroughness, the way he paid attention to corners and edges where dust liked to gather. These habits, learned young, would serve William throughout his career, would become as natural as breathing. The corbel still sat on its workbench, its surface now dry again, the polishing complete. Thomas ran his hand across it one final time, feeling for any roughness that might have escaped his attention. The stone felt smooth and true, ready for its journey upward into the cathedral's height. Tomorrow or the next day, the master mason would inspect it, and if approved, laborers would carry it up the scaffolding to where it would be mortared into place, becoming part of the structure's permanent fabric. Thomas gathered the smaller tools he would need for tomorrow's project. Another corbel, this one destined for the south transept, with a slightly different leaf pattern that the master mason had recently approved. He laid out the tools in sequence, preparing his workspace the way a scribe might prepare his desk before beginning a manuscript, ensuring that nothing would interrupt the flow of work once it began. The stone itself already waited on a bench, marked with the basic guidelines, ready to receive his attention. As the afternoon stretched toward evening, the lodge settled into a peaceful quiet. William had finished his tasks and now sat on a stone block, carefully sharpening one of the practiced chisels that had dulled during his morning work. The boy held the blade at the proper angle against the whetstone, moving it in careful strokes that would restore its edge. The sound was rhythmic and soothing, metal sliding across abrasive stone, creating sharpness through patient repetition. Thomas moved to the lodge's western opening and stood watching the light change across the landscape beyond the cathedral. The water meadows stretched away toward distant hills, their grasses golden in the lowering sun. Cattle grazed there, moving slowly through the warm afternoon, and their bells made small musical notes that carried on the breeze. The whole scene held a peacefulness that matched the quiet satisfaction in Thomas's chest, the sense of a day well spent, of labor that had added its small measure to something enduring. The evening bells rang for vespers, their tones spreading across the cathedral close and beyond, marking the day's gentle turn toward rest. Thomas listened to the familiar sequence, the largest bell first with its deep voice, then the smaller ones joining in harmonious layers, creating a sound that seemed to fill the air itself rather than simply move through it. He had heard these bells countless times, knew their voices as well as he knew the tools in his case, and they brought the same comfort each time, the reassurance of patterns that repeated day after day. William set aside the newly sharpened chisel and rose from his seat, stretching his young limbs after hours of focused work. The boy's hands bore the beginnings of calluses, the marks that would deepen over years until they became as permanent as Thomas's own work-hardened palms. Thomas nodded toward the door, and together they began the final tasks of closing the lodge for the night. They covered the unfinished stones with lengths of dampened cloth to keep the dust from settling on their surfaces, ensuring tomorrow's work would begin with clean material. The finished corbel received its own protection, a wooden box that Thomas had built specifically for completed pieces, designed to shield them from accidental damage while they awaited installation. He and William lifted the carved stone carefully, supporting its weight between them, and lowered it into the padded interior of the box. The corbel settled into place with a soft sound, and Thomas fitted the lid over it, securing the simple latch. One more piece ready, one more contribution to the cathedral's slow growth. They closed the shutters on the lodge's openings, leaving gaps that would allow air to circulate while keeping out any rain that might arrive during the night. The interior dimmed as the shutters blocked the evening light, and Thomas moved through the familiar space with the ease of long practice, his feet knowing where each stone and bench sat even in the reduced visibility. William followed, learning through observation where everything belonged, how the lodge transformed from workspace to secured storage with just a few careful actions. Outside, the cathedral close had taken on the softer colors of approaching dusk. The limestone walls glowed warmly in the horizontal light, and the shadows had grown long enough to merge into one another, creating pools of deeper shade beneath the scaffolding and around the base of the rising structure. Masons descended from the upper levels, their day's work complete, moving down the wooden ramps and ladders with careful steps. Their voices carried across the open ground, speaking of tomorrow's tasks and the progress achieved today. Thomas and William walked together along the path that led through the close toward the town beyond. The grass on either side of the worn earth had begun to dry with the seasons turning, taking on a golden cast that matched the stone they worked with daily. Small birds moved through the vegetation, settling for the night, their chirping creating a gentle chorus that accompanied the human sounds of evening, doors closing, voices calling greetings, the distant lowing of cattle being brought in from pasture. The apprentice lived with his family in a house near the marketplace, and Thomas walked part of the way with him, as had become their custom. They spoke little, both content after the day's labor, but the companionship felt comfortable, the shared silence of those who had worked side by side and understood the satisfaction of completed tasks. William's steps had the slight drag of tiredness, the natural fatigue that came from hours of physical attention, but his bearing remained upright, proud of his growing skill. They reached the point where their paths diverged, and Thomas clasped the boy's shoulder briefly, a gesture of acknowledgement for the day's good work. William smiled, his young face showing both exhaustion and contentment, then turned toward home. Thomas watched him go for a moment before continuing his own way, his feet following the route they had traveled for years, requiring no conscious guidance. His own dwelling stood in a row of similar houses, timber-framed structures with plaster walls and thatched roofs, each one home to craftsmen who worked on the cathedral or in the town's various trades. Smoke rose from several chimneys, carrying the scent of evening meals being prepared, onions and herbs, bread warming by hearths, the rich smell of pottage simmering in iron pots. Thomas's stomach reminded him that the midday bread and cheese had been many hours ago, and he quickened his pace slightly, anticipating the comfort of his own hearth. His wife, Margaret, 41 years old, with capable hands marked by years of household work and brown hair threaded with silver strands, looked up from the fire as he entered. She had been stirring a pot that hung from the crane, and the steam rising from it carried the familiar scent of barley and vegetables, seasoned with the herbs she grew in the small garden behind their house. She smiled at his arrival, setting aside the wooden spoon and moving to pour ale into a cup for him. Thomas settled onto the bench near the hearth, feeling the day's labor settle into his muscles, a pleasant ache that spoke of honest work completed. The interior of their home held the accumulated warmth of the cooking fire and the day's stored heat, creating a coziness that wrapped around him like a well-worn cloak. Margaret brought him the ale, then returned to her cooking, and he watched her move about the familiar space with the grace of long practice, her hands knowing exactly where each pot and utensil waited. The room itself bore the modest comfort of a craftsman's dwelling, a sturdy table, benches worn smooth by years of use, shelves holding wooden bowls and cups, a chest containing their best clothing for market days and holy days. Bundles of dried herbs hung from the rafters, and a basket of apples sat near the door, fruit from the trees that grew throughout the town. The walls showed traces of decoration, a simple wooden cross above the doorway, a length of woven wool that Margaret had made in colors of rust and cream. She ladled pottage into wooden bowls, the thick stew steaming and fragrant, filled with barley, turnips, onions, and a small amount of salted pork that gave it richness. They ate together at the table, the meal satisfying after the day's expenditure of energy. Margaret spoke of her own day, bread baked, mending completed, a visit to the market where she had purchased fresh candles from the chandler. Her voice held the same contentment that filled Thomas, the peace of a household running smoothly, of tasks accomplished in their proper order. After the meal, Margaret cleared the bowls and set them in a basin of water to soak, while Thomas remained at the table, his hands wrapped around a second cup of ale. The evening had settled fully now, and through the small window he could see the last traces of daylight fading from the sky, leaving behind the deeper blue that preceded true darkness. A few stars had begun to appear, faint points of light that would grow stronger as the night deepened. Margaret lit a rushlight from the cooking fire, setting it in the iron holder mounted on the wall. The small flame cast a gentle glow across the room, creating shadows that swayed slightly with the movement of air. She settled onto the bench beside Thomas, taking up a length of wool that needed spinning, her hands moving with practiced rhythm as the spindle turned and the fiber twisted into thread. The motion was meditative, requiring attention but leaving space for thought to wander or settle into quiet. Thomas watched her hands for a moment, appreciating the skill in them, the way they knew their work as thoroughly as his own new stone. Every household task she performed carried that same quality of competence built over years. The even loaves of bread she produced, the mended clothing where stitches were nearly invisible, the garden that yielded herbs and vegetables in their seasons. Her labor sustained their life together as surely as his work on the cathedral sustained their livelihood. The rushlight's flame burned steadily, its wick drawing oil up from the dish below, creating a small pool of illumination in the gathering darkness. Outside, the sounds of the town settling for night carried through the walls, a dog barking in the distance, the clip of hooves on packed earth as someone passed on horseback, the closing of shutters as neighbors secured their homes. These familiar sounds wove together into the texture of evening, reassuring in their predictability. Margaret's spindle hummed softly as it turned, the wool growing into thread that she would later weave or sell at the market. She worked without watching her hands, her fingers knowing the proper tension and twist through years of repetition. Her gaze rested on the fire, her expression peaceful, and Thomas felt a deep gratitude for the quiet companionship they shared, the comfort of presence that required no words to convey understanding. He rose eventually and moved to the chest where he kept a few personal items separate from the household goods. Among them was a small piece of limestone, no larger than his palm, that he had carved years ago during his apprenticeship. The piece showed a simple flower, the petals crude compared to what his hands could produce now, but he kept it as a reminder of beginnings, of the long path between first attempts and mastery. He ran his thumb across its surface, feeling the imperfections that his younger self had not yet learned to avoid. Margaret glanced over at the stone in his hands and smiled, recognizing it. She had seen him handle it before, this private ritual of remembering where skill began. She said nothing, understanding that some reflections required silence, but her smile conveyed recognition and affection. Thomas returned the carved flower to its place and came back to the hearth, adding another piece of wood to the fire. The dry timber caught quickly, flames licking up around it, releasing the scent of oak and a shower of small sparks that rose toward the smoke hole in the roof. The fire's warmth radiated outward, and Thomas felt the day's remaining tension ease from his shoulders. He had worked well, completed what he intended, prepared for tomorrow's labor. The corbel waited in its protective box, ready for inspection and installation. William had learned through observation and practice. The tools were cleaned and properly stored. These small satisfactions accumulated into the larger sense of a life lived according to its proper rhythms. Margaret finished the length of wool she had been spinning and set the spindle aside. She rose and moved to the basin where the bowls soaked, washing them with careful attention before drying them with a linen cloth and returning them to their shelf. The simple tasks of maintaining the household held their own dignity, their own contribution to the ordered life they had built together. Thomas watched her work, seeing in these evening rituals the same patience and precision that guided his own hands on stone. She banked the cooking fire for the night, pushing coals together and covering them with ash so they would hold until morning, ready to be rekindled without the need for flint and steel. The fire in the main hearth she left burning low, enough to keep warmth in the room through the cool hours before dawn. The rushlight still flickered on the wall, and by its glow they prepared for sleep, moving through the familiar sequence of securing the house for night. Thomas checked that the door was properly barred, the shutters latched, the few valuables they owned safely stored. Margaret laid out their sleeping pallet near the hearth, spreading the wool blankets that would keep them comfortable through the night. The bed was simple, straw-filled ticking covered with linen, elevated slightly on a wooden frame Thomas had built early in their marriage. It had served them well for years, and the familiarity of it brought its own comfort. They settled onto the pallet together, the day's labor making rest welcome. The fire's glow played across the rafters above, and Thomas could hear the faint stirring of the thatch in the evening breeze, a soft whisper that spoke of shelter and security. Margaret's breathing gradually deepened beside him, her body relaxing into sleep with the ease of someone whose conscience held no troubles, whose day had been spent in honest work. Thomas lay awake a while longer, watching the shadows shift across the ceiling, thinking of tomorrow's stone waiting in the lodge, of the pattern he would carve into its surface, of the cathedral growing stone by stone toward its completion. His hands rested on his chest, still bearing traces of limestone dust in their deepest creases despite washing, permanent marks of his trade. He flexed his fingers slightly, feeling the familiar strength in them, the capability they held for shaping resistant material into forms that would endure. The rushlight burned lower, its flame growing smaller as the oil diminished. Thomas watched it without urgency, knowing it would either last through the night or gutter out peacefully, both outcomes equally acceptable. His thoughts drifted like the smoke that rose from the hearth, following no particular path, simply moving through the comfortable spaces of a mind at ease with itself and its circumstances. The rushlight finally guttered out, leaving only the fire's faint glow to illuminate the room. Thomas felt sleep approaching like a gentle tide, his body sinking deeper into the comfort of the pallet, the day's work transforming into the peace of earned rest. Margaret's breathing had settled into the deep, even rhythm of sleep, and he listened to that familiar sound, finding in it the reassurance of companionship and shared life. His last thoughts before sleep took him were of the corbel waiting in the lodge, of the new stone marked and ready for tomorrow's attention, of William's growing skill, and the cathedral's patient rise toward completion. These thoughts held no urgency, no concern. They simply existed as part of the fabric of his life, elements that would be there when morning came, ready to receive his hands and his attention once more. Morning arrived with the sound of roosters calling across the town, their voices announcing the dawn before light had fully returned to the sky. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands and graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, woke gradually, his body emerging from sleep without haste. The fire had burned down to coals during the night, and the room held a coolness that spoke of autumn's continued approach. Margaret was already awake, rekindling the fire with small pieces of kindling that caught quickly from the buried coals. Flames rose and spread, pushing back the morning chill, and she set a pot of water to heat for washing. Thomas rose from the pallet and stretched, feeling his muscles remember yesterday's work, the comfortable ache that would ease once he began moving. He dressed in his work tunic and brace, pulling on the leather apron that bore the permanent marks of his trade, pale streaks of limestone dust, darker stains from dampened stone, small burns from hot tools. They broke their fast with bread left from the previous day, softened slightly by dipping it in warm milk that Margaret had fetched from the dairy at first light. The simple meal satisfied, preparing them for the day's labor ahead. Thomas ate slowly, letting his body wake fully, watching through the window as the sky brightened from gray to pale blue, the sun still below the horizon, but announcing its approach with growing light. He gathered his tools and left the house while the town still held the quiet of early morning. The path to the cathedral close showed damp with dew, and his footsteps left dark prints in the moisture. The air smelled of wood smoke and damp earth, of bread baking in ovens throughout the town, of the river that ran beyond the water meadows. A few other craftsmen moved along the paths, heading toward their own work, and Thomas exchanged nods with those he knew, wordless acknowledgments of shared purpose. The lodge stood exactly as he had left it, shutters closed, door secured. Thomas unlatched the entrance and pushed it open, admitting the morning light that streamed through the eastern opening. The interior smelled of limestone and wood, of materials waiting patiently for hands to shape them. He opened the remaining shutters, allowing cross-ventilation that would keep the air fresh throughout the day, then moved to uncover the stones he had protected the previous evening. The new corbel waited on its bench, the guidelines already marked, ready to receive his attention. This piece would mirror the one he had completed yesterday, but with subtle differences. The leaves would curve slightly more, creating deeper shadows, better suited to the south transept's light. Thomas ran his palm across the limestone's cool surface, feeling its texture, learning its character before beginning to cut. Each stone had its own personality, its own way of accepting or resisting the chisel, and knowing these qualities prevented mistakes. He selected his tools methodically, the heavier mallet first, the broader chisels for initial shaping. The first strike of the morning always felt significant, the moment when intention became action, when unmarked stone began its transformation. The chip that fell away was small but definite, and Thomas felt the familiar satisfaction of work begun properly. Another strike followed, then another, the rhythm establishing itself as naturally as breathing. William arrived as the sun cleared the horizon, the boy's face still showing signs of sleep, but his eagerness evident in his quick movements. He had brought fresh water from the well, filling the buckets that stood ready, ensuring they would have what they needed throughout the morning. Thomas acknowledged him with a nod, continuing his work while the apprentice began his own tasks, preparing tools, organizing materials, sweeping away the dust that had settled overnight despite the closed shutters. The morning unfolded with the same peaceful progression as the day before. Thomas worked steadily on the new corbel, removing material in careful increments, revealing the design that existed already within the stone, waiting only for skilled hands to make it visible. The mallet's percussion and the chisel's bite created their familiar music, and he lost himself in the meditation of repetitive action, each strike precisely placed, each removal of stone bringing him closer to the finished form. By mid-morning, the first leaf had begun to emerge, its edges still rough but its basic shape clear. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands, paused to examine his progress, turning the stone slightly on the bench to see how the light fell across the carved surface. Satisfied, he brushed away the accumulated dust and continued, beginning the second leaf with the same patient attention he had given the first. The second leaf took shape through the late morning hours, its curves flowing from Thomas's chisel with the ease of long practice. He had carved this particular pattern enough times that his hands seemed to know the path without conscious direction, following the natural grain of the stone, working with its structure rather than against it. The limestone yielded smoothly, its even texture making the work pleasurable, each strike producing exactly the result he intended. William worked at his own bench nearby, practicing the basic cuts that formed the foundation of the mason's craft. The boy's chisel moved more hesitantly than his master's, pausing between strikes as he considered angle and depth. But Thomas noted the carefulness in that hesitation, the desire to understand rather than simply repeat. That thoughtfulness would serve William well as his skill developed, would prevent the kind of haste that led to ruined stones and wasted labor. The bells rang for terce, their voices rolling across the cathedral close, and Thomas set down his tools to rest his hands. The morning's work had progressed well. Both leaves now showed clear form, needing only refinement and the addition of veining to bring them to completion. He walked to the water bucket and washed the dust from his hands and forearms, the water running milky as it carried away the accumulated powder. The coolness felt pleasant against his skin, refreshing after hours of focused effort. He stepped outside the lodge to observe the cathedral's progress from a distance. The scaffolding on the south transept had climbed higher since the previous week, and masons worked on the upper levels, setting stones into their mortar beds with careful precision. The sound of their labor drifted down, voices calling measurements, the scrape of trowels spreading mortar, the solid thunk of stones settling into place. Each sound spoke of the building's continued growth, of patient accumulation that would eventually reach completion. The sky had remained clear throughout the morning, its blue unmarred by clouds, and the sunlight fell warm on Thomas's face as he stood watching the work above. Swallows darted through the air around the cathedral, catching insects that rose from the ground with the day's warmth, their flight swift and joyful. He watched them for a moment, appreciating their grace, the way they moved through space with absolute confidence in their own capability. Returning to the lodge, Thomas found William had laid out their midday meal, bread and cheese again, but today with the addition of apples from the basket Margaret had sent along that morning. The fruit was crisp and sweet, its juice refreshing after the dry work of stone cutting. They ate in comfortable silence, seated on their usual blocks of finished stone, the lodge's interior holding the pleasant warmth of the advancing day. After eating, Thomas did not immediately return to the corbel. Instead, He moved to the area where templates hung on their pegs, studying the patterns for upcoming work. The master mason had approved several new designs the previous week, and Thomas wanted to familiarize himself with their details, to begin thinking about how each piece would translate from wooden pattern to carved stone. His eyes traced the curves and angles, his mind already planning the sequence of cuts that would bring each design to life. One template showed a capital with acanthus leaves, more elaborate than the simple designs he had been carving. The pattern would require careful attention to depth and undercutting to create the sense of leaves overlapping and curling away from the stone's surface. Thomas felt anticipation at the challenge, the opportunity to exercise skills that simpler work did not demand. Such pieces required days rather than hours, but the satisfaction they brought matched their complexity. He returned to his current corbel with renewed focus, taking up a finer chisel to add the veining to the completed leaves. These delicate lines would give the carving its final detail, suggesting the natural structure of actual foliage without attempting to replicate it exactly. The work required a light touch, barely more than scratching the surface, each vein following the leaf's curve in ways that appeared organic rather than mechanical. The afternoon light shifted gradually as he worked, its angle changing as the sun moved across the sky, revealing different aspects of the carving. Thomas adjusted his position to follow the best light, turning the stone when necessary to keep the working surface well illuminated. William had returned to his practice, and the steady sound of the boy's chisel provided a pleasant counterpoint to Thomas's more rapid strikes, the two rhythms weaving together like voices in plain chant. A breeze moved through the lodge, carrying the scent of the river and the water meadows beyond, mingling it with the ever-present smell of limestone dust and wood shavings. The combination spoke of the place where human craft met the natural world, where materials drawn from earth and forest became something new through patient application of skill and intention. Thomas, 38 years old, with graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, paused to appreciate that intersection. The way his work connected him to both the stone's ancient formation and the cathedral's future permanence. By the time the bells rang for none, the corbel's leaves bore their complete veining, the delicate lines catching light and shadow in ways that gave them depth and character. Thomas set aside the fine chisel and selected his rasps, beginning the process of smoothing away the small ridges left by cutting, bringing the surface toward its final refinement. The rasp whispered against the stone, its abrasive surface erasing tool marks, creating an evenness that would accept the final polishing. The work required patience but less concentration than the carving, and Thomas's thoughts wandered as his hands continued their steady motion. He thought of the corbel's eventual placement high in the south transept, of how it would appear to those who entered the cathedral for prayer or contemplation. Most would never notice the individual carved stones, would see only the whole structure rising around them. But that anonymity did not diminish the importance of each piece being crafted with care. He thought of William's progress, of how the boy's hands were beginning to learn the language of stone, developing the sensitivity that distinguished competent work from excellence. In another year or two, the apprentice would be ready to carve simple pieces for actual installation, moving beyond practice to contribution. That transition always pleased Thomas, the moment when teaching bore fruit in genuine capability. The rasp continued its patient work, smoothing and refining, and Thomas fell deeper into the meditation of repetitive motion. His breathing slowed to match the rhythm of his hands, and the afternoon seemed to expand, time becoming more spacious, less hurried. This quality of attention, this ability to lose himself completely in the present task, formed part of what he loved about his craft. The way it demanded full presence while simultaneously creating a space where worry and distraction could not enter. The smoothing continued through the afternoon, each pass of the rasp bringing the corbel closer to its finished state. Thomas worked systematically, covering every surface, ensuring no rough patches remained to catch the eye or hand. The stone dust that fell away now was finer than what the chisels had produced, a powder so light it seemed to float in the air before settling on the bench and floor. William would sweep it away later, gathering it with the day's other remnants, but for now it drifted peacefully in the slanting light. When Thomas judged the rasping complete, he dampened his polishing stone and began the final refinement. The water darkened the limestone to a deeper cream, and the circular motions of polishing brought up a subtle luster that would glow softly when the piece sat in place. He worked without haste, knowing that rushing this stage could undo hours of careful carving, could leave scratches that would mar the finished appearance. Each section received equal attention, each curve and hollow polished until the stone revealed its truest character. The shadows had grown noticeably longer by the time he set down the polishing stone and stepped back to examine the completed corbel. The 3 leaves curved outward with balanced grace, their veining catching the afternoon light, their surfaces smooth and even. The piece matched the quality of the one he had finished the day before, would serve its purpose faithfully for as long as the cathedral stood. Thomas felt the quiet satisfaction that always accompanied completed work, the sense of having added his measure to something greater than himself. He cleaned his tools methodically, wiping away dust and moisture, checking edges for sharpness, returning each implement to its proper place. This ritual of care ensured the tools would be ready for tomorrow's work, would serve him reliably for years to come. A mason's tools were extensions of his hands, and treating them with respect honored both the craft and the materials they shaped. William had finished his own tasks and now stood waiting, ready to help close the lodge for the evening. Together, they covered the unfinished stones with dampened cloth, secured the completed corbel in its protective box, and swept the floor clean of the day's accumulation. The apprentice worked with increasing confidence, his movements becoming more efficient as he learned the proper sequence of closing tasks. They secured the shutters and barred the door, leaving the lodge ready for tomorrow's early arrival. The cathedral close had begun to empty as other craftsmen finished their day's labor, descending from scaffolds and emerging from workshops, all moving toward home and evening rest. The light had softened to the warm gold of approaching dusk, and the limestone walls of the cathedral glowed as though lit from within. Thomas and William walked together along the familiar path, their boots raising small puffs of dust from the dry ground. The grass on either side had grown more golden since the previous day, the season's progression visible in these small changes. Birds called from the trees that bordered the close, settling into their evening roosts, and their songs created a gentle chorus that accompanied the human voices and footsteps. They parted at the usual place, and Thomas continued alone toward home. The town showed its evening character now, smoke rising from chimneys, the smell of cooking filling the air, children being called inside by mothers, shutters closing as households prepared for night. He passed the baker's shop where he purchased his daily bread, the chandler's where Margaret bought their candles, the smith's forge where the fire still glowed though the day's work had ended. His own door stood slightly ajar, and he pushed it open to find Margaret, 41 years old, with capable hands marked by years of household work and brown hair threaded with silver strands, tending the cooking fire. She looked up at his entrance and smiled, her expression conveying welcome and the contentment of her own day's work completed. The pot hanging from the crane held tonight's pottage, and its scent filled the room. Turnips and onions, barley and herbs, the comforting smell of simple food prepared with care. Thomas settled onto his bench near the hearth, feeling the day's labor settle into his bones in that pleasant way that spoke of honest effort. Margaret brought him ale in his usual cup, then returned to stirring the pottage, ensuring it did not stick to the pot's bottom. He watched her move about their home, her capable hands marked by years of household work performing each task with the same practiced ease his own hands brought to stone. She had baked bread that afternoon, and the loaves sat cooling on the table, their crusts dark and substantial. The interior of the house held the warmth of the cooking fire and the lingering heat from the baking, creating a coziness that invited rest. Thomas sipped his ale slowly, letting the day's focus gradually release its hold, his mind transitioning from the particularity of carving to the broader awareness of evening and home. When the pottage had cooked sufficiently, Margaret ladled it into their wooden bowls, the thick stew steaming and fragrant. They ate together at the table, tearing pieces from the fresh bread to soak in the rich broth. The meal satisfied deeply, replacing the energy the day's work had consumed, and Thomas felt gratitude for this simple abundance: food enough, warmth enough, companionship enough. These sufficiencies formed the foundation of contentment. Margaret spoke of her own day as they ate, the bread baked successfully, the mending completed, a visit from a neighbor who had shared news of a daughter's upcoming wedding. Her voice carried the peaceful rhythm of ordinary events, nothing urgent or troubling, simply the flow of household life continuing in its accustomed patterns. Thomas listened with half his attention, the other half still dwelling in the quiet satisfaction of the completed corbel, of tomorrow's stone waiting in the lodge. After the meal, Margaret cleared the bowls while Thomas remained at the table, his hands wrapped around his cup. The evening had arrived fully now, the last light fading from the sky, leaving only the fire's glow and the rushlight's small flame to illuminate the room. Through the window, he could see a few stars beginning to appear, those first bright points that preceded the night's full display. Margaret took up her spinning, settling onto the bench beside him, her hands finding their rhythm with the spindle and wool. The motion was hypnotic, the twist of fiber becoming thread, the spindle turning in its endless rotation. Thomas watched for a moment, then let his gaze drift to the fire, his thoughts moving without particular direction through the comfortable spaces of a mind at ease. The spindle's hum provided a soft accompaniment to the fire's occasional crackle, and Thomas felt the day's remaining tension dissolve completely. His shoulders relaxed, his breathing deepened, and the warmth from the hearth seemed to seep into his very bones. Margaret's presence beside him required nothing. No conversation, no activity, simply the quiet companionship of two people who had shared years together and understood the value of peaceful silence. The rushlight flickered slightly as a draft moved through the room, its flame bending but not extinguishing, casting shifting shadows across the rafters above. Thomas watched the play of light and darkness, his mind empty of concern, filled only with the present moment's gentle textures. Outside, the town had grown quieter, most households already settled for the night, only the occasional sound of a closing door or a dog's distant bark breaking the stillness. Margaret finished the length of wool she had been spinning and wound the new thread carefully onto the growing bundle. Her hands moved with unconscious grace, performing tasks so familiar they required no thought, leaving her mind free to rest even as her fingers worked. She set the spindle aside and rose to check the banked cooking fire, ensuring the coals would hold through the night, ready to be revived at dawn. Thomas stood as well and moved to secure the house for sleep. He checked the door's bar, tested the shutter's latches, ensured the few items of value they possessed were safely stored. These nightly rituals brought their own comfort, the reassurance of protection and order maintained. Margaret prepared their sleeping pallet near the hearth, spreading the wool blankets that would keep them warm through the cool hours before morning. They settled onto the pallet together, the straw-filled ticking rustling softly beneath them, then falling quiet. The fire burned low, its flames barely visible above the coals, but its warmth remained constant. Thomas lay on his back, looking up at the darkened rafters, his body grateful for the horizontal rest after a day spent standing at the workbench. Margaret's breathing beside him gradually slowed and deepened, moving toward sleep with the ease of someone whose day had been full and satisfying. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands and graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, flexed his fingers slightly, feeling the familiar strength still present despite the day's use. Tomorrow those hands would return to the lodge, would take up tools again, would begin shaping another stone toward its appointed purpose. The knowledge brought satisfaction rather than weariness. This was work that suited him, that gave his life structure and meaning. His thoughts drifted to the two completed corbels now waiting in their protective boxes, ready for the master mason's inspection. Both pieces represented hours of careful attention, of skill applied with patience, of material transformed through understanding and respect. When they finally sat in their places high in the cathedral's interior, they would become part of something that would outlast not only his own life, but the lives of generations yet unborn. The rushlight was burning very low now, its oil nearly consumed, and Thomas watched its flame grow smaller and smaller until finally it guttered out completely. The room fell into deeper darkness, lit only by the fire's faint glow. He found the darkness soothing rather than troubling, a natural conclusion to the day's cycle, a space for rest and restoration before the return of light. Margaret had fallen fully asleep now, her breathing deep and even, and Thomas listened to that familiar sound, finding in it a meditation that drew him closer to sleep himself. The sound was as much a part of his life as the bells that marked the cathedral's hours, as constant and reliable as the stone beneath his hands. He felt fortunate to have this partnership, this shared life built through years of small kindnesses and mutual respect. His body sank deeper into the palate's comfort, the day's accumulated fatigue transforming into a pleasant heaviness that pulled him toward sleep. The fire's warmth wrapped around him like an embrace, and the darkness felt soft rather than absolute, a gentle presence rather than an absence of light. His last conscious thoughts were fragmentary: the Corbel's carved leaves, William's growing skill, tomorrow's unmarked stone, Margaret's capable hands marked by years of household work moving through their daily tasks. Sleep came gradually, not as a sudden falling but as a gentle descent, his awareness dimming degree by degree until consciousness released its hold entirely. His breathing synchronized with Margaret's, both of them breathing the same rhythm, sharing the same peaceful space between waking and dreams. The house around them settled into its own rest, timber and thatch holding the warmth inside, keeping the night's coolness at bay. The fire burned lower still, its coals glowing red beneath a layer of ash, pulsing gently with each slight movement of air. The light it cast grew fainter and fainter, shadows deepening in the corners of the room, but the warmth remained constant, reliable, sufficient. Outside, the stars continued their slow wheel across the sky, marking time's passage while the town slept below. In the lodge across the town, the covered stones waited in darkness, patient as the earth they had come from. The tools hung on their pegs, ready for morning's hands. The completed corbels rested in their boxes, their carved surfaces holding the memory of the hands that shaped them. Everything waited in stillness for the return of light, for the resuming of work, for the continuation of the cathedral's patient growth. But now there was only rest, only the deep quiet of night settling over the town, over the close, over the rising cathedral walls. There was only the slow breathing of sleep, the gentle holding of warmth against coolness, the peaceful suspension of effort and intention. The day's work was complete, tomorrow's work would come in its time, and between them lay this space of restoration, this gift of rest that asked nothing and gave everything. Thomas's hands lay still on his chest, finally released from the day's labor, his calloused palms turned upward in a gesture of openness and peace. The stone dust permanently settled into the creases caught the fire's last faint light, glinting briefly before the darkness deepened further. His breathing continued its slow rhythm, in and out, like waves on a distant shore, like wind through summer grass, like time itself moving forward in its unhurried way, patient and endless and kind. The night deepened around the sleeping town, and the darkness became complete as the fire's coals dimmed to their faintest glow. Thomas lay in profound rest, his body surrendered fully to sleep's restoration, his mind released from thought into the deeper quiet that preceded dreams. The weight of the wool blankets held him gently, and the straw beneath the pallets ticking had molded itself to his form, cradling him in familiar comfort. Margaret's presence beside him continued steady and peaceful, her breathing so even it seemed part of the night's own rhythm. The warmth they shared beneath the blankets created a small haven against the autumn coolness that pressed against the house's walls. No sound disturbed the stillness. The town had fallen completely quiet. Every household settled into its own rest, the streets empty and silent under the stars. Hours passed unmeasured and unmarked, time flowing forward without urgency or event. The coals in the hearth pulsed faintly with their stored heat, glowing and dimming in slow cycles. But even this subtle light gradually faded until the room held only darkness. The air grew cooler as the night progressed toward its deepest point, that hour before dawn when the earth itself seemed to pause and rest. Thomas's sleep remained undisturbed, his body utterly relaxed, his face peaceful in repose. His hands had loosened their position on his chest, falling slightly to the sides, fingers curled naturally. The stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands was invisible now in the darkness, but it remained there as it always did, the permanent mark of his trade, the testament to years of patient labor shaping resistant material into forms of grace. The cathedral stood silent across the town, its unfinished walls rising dark against the starlit sky. The scaffolding clung to its sides, empty now of the masons who would return with morning's light. Inside the lodge, the tools waited on their pegs and the covered stones rested on their benches, everything suspended in the stillness that preceded the day's renewal. The two completed corbels sat in their protective boxes, their carved surfaces holding their forms in darkness, patient as the limestone from which they had been made. In the water meadows beyond the town, cattle lay in their pastures, their breathing slow and deep, their bodies warm against the cooling earth. The river moved past with its constant murmur, a sound so steady it became part of the silence rather than a break from it. The grass bent slightly in the night breeze, releasing its scent of drying vegetation and approaching autumn, though no one was awake to notice. The stars wheeled slowly overhead, their light reaching down across unimaginable distances to touch the sleeping town, the rising cathedral, the lodge where tomorrow's work waited. Constellations shifted their positions degree by degree, marking time's passage in their ancient patterns. The moon, past full now and waning, had already set beyond the western hills, leaving the stars to rule the darkness alone. Thomas's breathing continued its slow rhythm, so deep, and even it seemed he had become part of the night itself, indistinguishable from the quiet that surrounded him. His sleep held no dreams, no images or narratives, only the profound rest of a body and mind released completely from the day's concerns. This was the deepest kind of peace, the restoration that came when consciousness withdrew entirely, allowing the body to tend to its own renewal without interference. Margaret slept beside him in the same profound stillness, her brown hair threaded with silver strands spread across the pillow they shared, her capable hands marked by years of household work resting quietly on the blanket. Together, they breathed the same air, shared the same warmth, existed in the same peaceful suspension of activity and awareness. The years they had spent together had created a harmony that extended even into sleep, their presences complementing each other without effort or thought. The house around them creaked occasionally as timber settled with the temperature's fall, but these sounds were part of the structure's own rest, the natural adjustments of materials responding to the night's coolness. The thatch overhead held firm against any breeze, keeping the interior protected and secure. Everything was as it should be, everything in its proper place, everything safe and still. In other houses throughout the town, Other craftsmen slept their own deep sleep, their bodies recovering from their particular labors. The blacksmith whose arms had swung the hammer all day, the carpenter whose hands had guided saw and plane, the weaver whose fingers had passed the shuttle back and forth through countless threads. Each one resting now, each one released from effort, each one held in sleep's gentle embrace. The night moved toward its turning point, that moment when darkness would begin its slow retreat before the approaching dawn. But that moment had not yet arrived. For now there was only the deep stillness, the complete quiet, the utter peace of a world suspended between days ending and days beginning. Time existed but did not press forward. Darkness held everything in its soft grasp, asking nothing, demanding nothing, simply being. Thomas's face remained peaceful in repose, his features relaxed, his graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord barely visible against the pillow. The lines that sun and concentration had etched around his eyes seemed softer in sleep, and the set of his mouth spoke of contentment rather than effort. His chest rose and fell with perfect regularity, each breath drawn and released without hesitation or catch, the fundamental rhythm of life continuing its patient work. The coals in the hearth had gone completely dark now, their heat still present but their light extinguished. The room existed in total darkness, yet this darkness felt complete rather than empty, full rather than void. It was the darkness of deep rest, of restoration, of the earth turning slowly through the night toward morning's inevitable return. Everything that needed to happen in darkness was happening, sleep deepening, bodies renewing, peace settling into every corner of awareness. Outside, the stars continued their slow procession across the sky, faithful in their patterns, constant in their light. The town slept beneath them, safe and still, held in the night's gentle hands. The darkness held its deepest point, that hour when night seemed most complete, when the earth itself rested in profound stillness. Thomas remained in sleep's deepest chamber, his breathing so slow, and even it seemed barely to disturb the air. His body had found its perfect position of comfort, requiring no adjustment, no shift of weight or limb. The wool blankets rose and fell with each gentle breath, their weight providing just enough pressure to feel secure without constraint. Margaret's sleep continued beside him with the same depth, her presence a steady warmth that required no acknowledgement to be felt. The years of sharing this space had created an understanding that transcended waking awareness, a harmony that expressed itself in the way their bodies naturally found rest near each other, in the unconscious comfort each drew from the other's proximity. The house stood solid around them, its timbers and thatch fulfilling their purpose of shelter without fanfare or notice. The walls kept the night's coolness at bay while allowing air to circulate gently, maintaining the balance between protection and breath. Everything in the structure worked together silently, beams supporting thatch, posts supporting beams, foundation supporting all, each element performing its role in the quiet conspiracy of shelter. In the complete darkness, Thomas's hands rested without tension, his calloused palms open and relaxed. The strength that lived in those hands during waking hours had released itself entirely now. The fingers curved naturally, no grip or purpose holding them in any particular shape. The stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands remained there as always, invisible in the darkness but present, the permanent trace of his life's work. The town around them held its own collective stillness. Every hearth had dimmed to darkness or the faintest glow, every shutter secured, every door barred. The streets lay empty under the stars, their packed earth surfaces undisturbed by footstep or hoof. Dogs slept in their yards, chickens roosted in their coops, horses stood quiet in their stables. All the ordinary life of the town had withdrawn into rest, waiting for dawn's signal to resume. Beyond the town's boundaries, the countryside held the same deep quiet. The water meadows stretched away in darkness, their grasses bent with dew that had formed as the earth cooled. The river continued its patient flow, its surface reflecting starlight in patterns that shifted and reformed with each subtle movement of current. Trees stood dark against the sky, their leaves rustling so softly the sound was less than a whisper. The cathedral rose from the close like a prayer made solid, its incomplete walls reaching upward even in darkness, even in the absence of human hands to shape them further. The limestone held the day's warmth and released it slowly into the night air, a gentle exhalation that spoke of the sun's touch and the patient transformation of quarried stone into sacred architecture. The building waited for morning's return, for the resumption of work, but in this hour it simply existed, solid and patient. In the lodge beside the cathedral, the tools hung motionless on their pegs, each one suspended in exactly the position where Thomas's hands had placed it. The chisels with their various profiles, the mallets with their worn handles, the rasps and files and polishing stones, all waited in darkness for the hands that would give them purpose again. The covered stones on the benches remained untouched, their surfaces holding the potential of forms not yet revealed, patterns not yet carved, beauty not yet made visible. The two completed corbels rested in their protective boxes, their carved leaves perfect in the darkness as they had been in light. The stone remembered the touch of Thomas's hands, held the shape those hands had given it, bore the marks of patient attention transformed into permanent form. Whether seen or unseen, whether lit or dark, the carvings maintained their integrity, their careful proportions, their quiet grace. Thomas's sleep had no awareness of time passing, no sense of duration or progression. There was only the deep rest, the complete release from consciousness, the body's quiet work of restoration proceeding without observation or interference. His breathing continued its slow tide, in and out, each cycle complete and sufficient, requiring nothing beyond itself. The rhythm matched Margaret's beside him, the two patterns synchronized without intention, simply finding their natural harmony. The stars overhead had continued their gradual wheel, their positions shifted from where they had been hours earlier, though the darkness remained complete. The constellations ancient peoples had named, and stories had been told about moved through their eternal patterns, indifferent to human sleep or waking, marking time on a scale that made human lifespans seem like single breaths. Yet they shone down with the same light that had illuminated other nights, other sleepers, other towns throughout centuries beyond counting. In the deep stillness, nothing demanded attention or response. No sound broke the quiet, no light pierced the darkness, no event disturbed the peace. There was only rest, only the gentle holding of sleep, only the patient passage of night toward its eventual transformation into day. The world turned slowly on its axis, carrying the sleeping town through darkness toward light, but that arrival remained distant still, the night holding its claim for hours yet to come. Thomas's face in sleep showed no lines of concern, no tension around the eyes or mouth. His features held the relaxation that came only with complete release from waking consciousness, the peace that lived beneath thought and worry, beneath intention and plan. His graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord rested against the pillow, and his breathing moved through him like a gentle tide, requiring nothing, asking nothing, simply being. The blankets covering him and Margaret held their warmth, creating a small climate of comfort that existed independent of the room's cooler air. This warmth asked no fuel to maintain itself, drew on no resource but the heat their own bodies generated, stored and reflected back by the wool's patient weave. It was warmth enough, comfort enough, exactly what the night required and nothing more. Outside, the night continued its slow progression, moving toward the turning point that would eventually come but had not yet arrived. The darkness remained complete, the stars remained bright, the town remained wrapped in sleep's gentle embrace. Everything rested in its appointed place, everything waited in patient stillness, everything existed in the profound peace that preceded dawn's return. The night held all of this in its dark hands. The sleeping town, the rising cathedral, Thomas and Margaret in their quiet rest, the whole world suspended in the gentle space between yesterday's end and tomorrow's beginning. The night began its subtle shift, imperceptible at first, a change felt rather than seen in the quality of darkness. The stars overhead maintained their brightness, but something in the air itself whispered of the approaching transition, of the long arc of night beginning its slow curve toward completion. The town remained deep in sleep, unaware of this earliest hint, wrapped in the same profound rest that had held it for hours. Thomas's breathing continued its patient rhythm, unchanged by the night's progression. His body remained in its position of complete comfort, his muscles released from all tension, his mind resting in depths beyond dreaming. The sleep that held him had reached its fullest measure, the restoration his body required nearly complete, though consciousness remained far distant still. Margaret slept beside him with the same depth, her presence steady and peaceful, the two of them breathing the same air, sharing the same darkness, existing in the same suspended moment. The house around them had settled into its coolest point, the hour when the previous day's accumulated warmth had finally dissipated, and the new day's heat had not yet begun to gather. The air inside held a freshness that came with this deepest cool, crisp and clean, though not uncomfortably cold. The banked coals in the hearth maintained their buried warmth, ready to be revived when morning came, patient in their half-life between flame and ash. In the streets of the town, the first stirrings of life began so quietly they disturbed nothing. A rooster in a distant yard lifted its head, sensing what human sleepers could not yet perceive, preparing for the call it would soon send across the rooftops. A cat emerged from whatever shelter it had found for the night, stretching its body in the darkness, beginning its own transition from rest to activity. These small movements marked the turning point, though the darkness remained absolute and the stars still commanded the sky. The cathedral stood unchanged in the close, its walls holding their forms in darkness as they would in light, patient and permanent. The scaffolding that climbed its sides showed as darker shapes against the lighter stone, and the whole structure maintained its upward reach even without human eyes to see it. Inside the lodge, the tools and stones waited in the same stillness they had held throughout the night, ready but requiring no readiness, simply being what they were until hands would give them purpose again. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands and graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, remained deep in sleep's embrace. His face held its peaceful expression, his body its comfortable position, his breathing its slow and even rhythm. The night had given him what he needed: hours of undisturbed rest, restoration of strength spent in the previous day's labor, renewal of the capacity that would be required when work resumed. His hands rested quietly, holding no tension, bearing no burden, simply existing in their own patient stillness. The stars had wheeled further through their patterns, their positions shifted measurably now from where they had hung hours earlier. The brightest among them still commanded attention, but their absolute dominion over the darkness had begun its slow retreat. The change remained subtle, visible only to eyes that watched with particular attention, but it had begun nonetheless, the eternal cycle turning once more, darkness preparing to yield though it had not yet begun to fade. Margaret's sleep held its own depth, her breathing synchronized with Thomas's in the way that years of shared nights had made natural. Her capable hands, marked by years of household work, rested on the blanket, relaxed and still, holding no task, performing no work, simply being at rest. Her brown hair, threaded with silver strands, lay spread across the pillow, and her face showed the same peace that marked Thomas's features, the complete release from waking concerns that deep sleep provided. The wool blankets that covered them had absorbed their warmth throughout the night, becoming vessels of comfort that gave back what the sleepers' bodies had provided. The weight remained constant, the temperature steady, creating conditions perfect for continued rest. Nothing disturbed this equilibrium, no draft of cold air, no uncomfortable pressure, no sound to pierce the stillness. Everything conspired toward peace, toward the continuation of restoration that sleep provided. In the water meadows, the dew lay heavy on the grass, each blade bent slightly with the weight of moisture condensed from the cooling air. The droplets caught starlight and held it, creating tiny points of reflected brightness scattered across the dark ground. The river moved through its channel with the same patient flow, its surface occasionally catching light from the sky, briefly shimmering before returning to darkness. The whole landscape waited in stillness, poised between night's depth and morning's approach. The town's collective sleep had begun to lighten in some households, though most remained deep in rest. Here and there, a person stirred slightly, turning in sleep, adjusting position without waking, the body making its small preparations for eventual return to consciousness, though that return remained distant. Bakers would wake soon, their ovens needing time to heat before bread could be formed and set to bake, but even they still slept, drawing the last measures of rest before duty called them to rise. Thomas's chest rose and fell with unchanging regularity, each breath drawn and released with perfect ease. His body knew how to rest as thoroughly as it knew how to work, surrendering completely to sleep's requirements, making no resistance to unconsciousness. The ache from yesterday's labor had eased during the night's passage, muscles restored through rest, strength replenished through stillness. When morning came and work resumed, His hands would find their tools with the same capability they had shown the day before, ready to shape stone with patient attention. The darkness remained complete in the room where Thomas and Margaret slept, no hint yet of the dawn that would eventually come. The shutters kept out whatever faint changes might be occurring in the sky beyond, maintaining the interior's perfect blackness. But outside, the very air had begun to shift, to hold itself differently, to prepare for transformation, though the stars still shone and darkness still held the earth in its grasp. A slight breeze moved through the town, barely strong enough to stir the leaves on trees, but carrying with it the scent of the coming day, earth waiting to be warmed, grass holding dew, the river's mineral freshness. This breeze touched shutters and thatch, moved along empty streets, circled the cathedral's rising walls, but disturbed nothing, woke no one, simply passed through like a messenger whose words would be understood only later. The breeze faded to stillness again, and the town remained wrapped in its deep quiet. Thomas's sleep continued undisturbed, his body having found the perfect balance of rest and restoration. Hours had passed since he first closed his eyes, and the night had given him everything he needed: silence, darkness, comfort, peace. His breathing moved through him with the ease of water flowing in its natural channel, requiring no effort, no attention, simply continuing in its gentle rhythm. Margaret shifted slightly in her sleep, a small movement that brought her closer to Thomas's warmth, though neither of them woke. Her body adjusted itself and settled again into stillness, her breathing resuming its even pace after the brief interruption. The blankets moved with her, then fell quiet, and the room returned to its profound stillness. These small adjustments were part of sleep's natural pattern, the body's way of maintaining comfort throughout the long hours of rest. In the eastern sky beyond the town, beyond the water meadows and the distant hills, the first imperceptible change had begun. No light showed yet, no color touched the darkness, but the quality of the black itself had shifted, becoming somehow less absolute, less infinite. A person watching might not have been able to name the difference, but it existed nonetheless. The earliest whisper of transformation, the first breath of the approaching day. The rooster that had stirred earlier now lifted its head fully and released its first call, the sound cutting through the silence with sudden clarity. The crow carried across rooftops and empty streets, announcing what human sleepers could not yet perceive. Other roosters answered from their own yards, and soon a chorus of calls spread through the town, each bird adding its voice to the proclamation of morning's approach, though darkness still held complete dominion over the visible world. Thomas's sleep remained deep despite the rooster's calls, his body not yet ready to release its hold on rest. His mind stayed suspended in that place beyond dreaming, that quiet depth where consciousness had no foothold, where only the body's slow work of restoration continued. His hands lay still on his chest, the calloused palms holding their relaxed position, the fingers curved naturally, everything at peace. The air in the room had grown slightly cooler with the approach of dawn, that particular chill that came just before the sun's return would begin to warm the earth again. But the wool blankets held their warmth faithfully, and neither Thomas nor Margaret felt the change in temperature. They remained comfortable, protected, their sleep undisturbed by the subtle shifts occurring around them. Outside, the darkness had begun its reluctant retreat. though it happened so gradually that each moment seemed unchanged from the one before. The stars remained visible, still bright, but something in the sky behind them had shifted, a lightning so faint it existed at the very edge of perception. The eastern horizon held this change most clearly, though even there, darkness still ruled. The hills showed as slightly darker shapes against a sky that had become merely dark rather than absolutely black. In the lodge beside the cathedral, the covered stones waited on their benches, the tools hung on their pegs, everything exactly as it had been throughout the night. But the quality of darkness in the lodge had changed slightly, and though no light yet penetrated the shuttered openings, the space itself seemed to hold itself differently, preparing for the transformation that would come with dawn's arrival. The completed corbels rested in their boxes, their carved surfaces unchanged, their patient beauty maintained in darkness as it would be in light. Margaret's eyes opened slowly, her body responding to signals that consciousness had not yet fully understood. She lay still for a moment, oriented herself in the familiar darkness of her home, felt Thomas's steady breathing beside her. The household's morning tasks called to her in that quiet way that duty always did: fire to revive, water to heat, bread to prepare. She moved carefully, not wanting to disturb Thomas's continued rest, sliding from beneath the blankets with practiced ease. The floor felt cool beneath her feet as she stood, and she reached for the shawl that hung nearby, wrapping it around her shoulders. Her capable hands, marked by years of household work, found what they needed even in darkness: the poker for the hearth, the kindling kept ready in its basket, the flint and steel for striking sparks if the coals had died completely. She moved to the hearth and knelt before it, pushing aside the ash that covered the banked coals. A faint glow rewarded her careful uncovering. The coals had held their heat through the night as she had known they would. She added small pieces of kindling, positioning them to catch the heat without smothering it, and blew gently on the embers. The kindling began to smoke, then caught with small flames that grew quickly, casting the first light into the room since the rushlight had guttered out hours before. Margaret added larger pieces of wood, building the fire carefully, and soon flames rose bright and warm, pushing back the darkness and the morning chill. The fire's light revealed the room in flickering detail: the table where they had eaten, the bench where Thomas still slept, the shelves with their orderly arrangement of household items. Margaret moved to the water bucket and found it nearly full, enough for morning's needs without requiring an immediate trip to the well. She poured water into the pot and hung it from the crane over the fire, setting it to heat for washing and for the porridge she would prepare for their morning meal. Thomas stirred slightly as the fire's warmth and light reached him, his body beginning its slow journey back toward consciousness. His breathing changed rhythm, becoming less deep, more variable, as sleep's hold gradually loosened. His eyes remained closed, but his awareness had begun its return, bringing with it the gradual recognition of the new day, of the bed beneath him, of Margaret's movements in the room. He lay still for a moment longer, allowing the transition to complete itself naturally, not rushing the passage from sleep to waking. Margaret had moved to the bread from the previous evening and began slicing it for toasting over the fire. The knife made soft sounds as it worked through the dense loaf, and these small domestic noises helped draw Thomas further into waking. He opened his eyes finally, seeing the familiar rafters above him lit by firelight, and he felt the deep satisfaction of having slept well, of waking naturally rather than being jarred from rest by alarm or urgency. He sat up slowly, his body taking its time to adjust to the vertical, and he ran his hands through his graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, checking that it remained secure. His hands, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused palms, moved to rub his face, clearing the last traces of sleep from his eyes. The day waited for him, the lodge, the tools, the stone marked and ready for carving. But there was time still, time for the slow transition that morning required, time to break fast and prepare properly before work began. Margaret glanced over at Thomas as he rose from the pallet, and she offered him a small smile, the quiet acknowledgement of another morning begun together. She had set the bread slices near the fire to toast, and their scent had begun to fill the room, mingling with the smell of wood smoke and the heating water. Thomas stretched carefully, feeling his muscles remember their purposes after the night's stillness, and he moved to the basin where he could wash his face and hands before the day's work truly began. The water Margaret had set aside the night before felt cool against his skin, refreshing and clarifying. He splashed his face, rubbing away the last vestiges of sleep, then dried himself with the linen cloth that hung nearby. His reflection in the small, polished metal mirror showed a face marked by years of outdoor work and concentrated attention, lines around the eyes from squinting at stone in various lights, a weathered quality to the skin from seasons spent in the lodge's open air. He tied his leather cord more securely, ensuring his graying brown hair would stay back from his face during the day's carving. Margaret had prepared a simple porridge from oats, and she ladled it into their bowls, adding a small amount of honey she had traded for at the market. The sweetness would give them energy for the morning's work ahead. They sat together at the table, the toasted bread between them, and ate without hurry. The fire burned steadily now, its warmth filling the room, and through the shutters came the first true evidence of dawn, not light exactly, but a lessening of absolute darkness, a sense that the world outside was beginning to reveal itself. Thomas chewed the porridge slowly, appreciating its warmth and substance. Margaret had cooked it to exactly the right consistency, neither too thick nor too thin, the oats soft but retaining some texture. The honey provided sweetness without overwhelming the grain's natural flavor. He tore a piece of the toasted bread and dipped it in the porridge, the combination satisfying and familiar, the kind of meal that prepared body and mind for the day's demands. They spoke little during the meal, both of them naturally quiet in the early morning, content with the companionship that required no words. Margaret ate her own portion with the same measured pace, and when they had finished, she cleared the bowls and set them in the basin to soak. Thomas remained at the table for a moment longer, finishing the last of his morning ale, feeling his body fully wake now, energy returning to his limbs, his mind beginning to focus on the work waiting at the lodge. He rose and gathered his tools from where they waited near the door, his leather apron, the small bag containing his personal chisels that he preferred to keep at home rather than leaving in the lodge. Margaret handed him a cloth-wrapped bundle containing bread and cheese for his midday meal, and he tucked it into the bag with his tools. She had packed enough for both him and William, knowing the apprentice's family sometimes struggled to provide adequate provisions. The door opened onto a world transformed by the approaching dawn. The darkness had retreated significantly now, and though the sun had not yet appeared above the horizon, the sky showed gradations of color, deep blue overhead fading to lighter shades near the east, where a band of pale gold announced the sun's imminent arrival. The stars had faded to invisibility except for the brightest, and the whole world seemed poised in that moment of transition, neither night nor day, but something between. Thomas stepped out into the cool morning air, and Margaret stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him go as she did each morning. He turned back once to raise his hand in farewell, and she returned the gesture before stepping inside and closing the door against the chill. The path before him showed clearly now in the growing light, and his boots made soft sounds on the packed earth as he walked toward the cathedral close. Other craftsmen had begun to emerge from their houses, moving along various paths toward their own work sites. Thomas exchanged nods with those he passed, wordless greetings that acknowledged shared purpose and the early hour. A baker's apprentice hurried past carrying a basket of fresh loaves, their steam rising in the cool air, and the scent followed him down the street. Somewhere nearby, a blacksmith's forge was being lit, and Thomas could hear the first sounds of bellows working to bring the coals to proper heat. The cathedral close opened before him as he rounded the final corner, and he paused for a moment to take in the sight that never failed to move him. The great church rising against the lightening sky, its walls substantial and purposeful, its incomplete height promising even greater majesty when the work finally reached completion. The scaffolding showed clearly now, and he could see other masons already climbing toward their assigned positions, early risers who preferred to begin work as soon as light allowed. The lodge door stood where he had left it the previous evening, securely barred. Thomas lifted the latch and pushed it open, admitting the morning's cool air into the space that still held traces of yesterday's limestone dust and wood shavings. He opened the shutters systematically, allowing light to flood the interior, revealing the covered stones, the waiting tools, the two completed corbels in their protective boxes. Everything stood ready, exactly as it should be. He lit a small fire in the brazier that stood in one corner, more for comfort than necessity, though the warmth would be welcome as the morning progressed. The kindling caught quickly, and soon flames rose cheerfully, casting additional light across the workspace. Thomas removed the cloths from the stones, checking each one briefly. The corbel he had completed 2 days ago, the one from yesterday, and the new piece marked and ready for today's attention. The new stone called to him with its potential, its surface waiting to receive the pattern his hands would reveal. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands and graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, ran his palm across the cool limestone, feeling its texture, learning its character. The guidelines he had marked were clear and true, ready to guide his chisel through the initial cuts. He selected his tools with care, arranging them in the sequence he would need them, preparing his workspace with the attention to detail that years had taught him, prevented mistakes and wasted effort. William arrived as the sun finally broke above the horizon, its first rays streaming across the close and through the lodge's eastern opening. The boy's face showed the remnants of sleep, but his eyes held eagerness, and he moved immediately to his assigned tasks, filling the water buckets from the well, sweeping away any dust that had settled overnight, preparing the materials Thomas might need throughout the morning. The apprentice worked without needing instruction, having learned the routine through repetition, and Thomas appreciated that growing competence. The sun continued its rise, climbing above the horizon with steady progress, and the light flooding through the lodge's openings changed from pale gold to brighter yellow, illuminating the workspace with increasing clarity. Thomas positioned himself at the bench where the new corbel waited, his body finding its familiar stance, his weight distributed properly for the hours of work ahead. He lifted the mallet in his right hand, positioned the chisel against the first guideline with his left, and paused for just a moment before beginning. The first strike of the day sent a small chip of limestone falling to the floor, and Thomas felt the satisfaction that always came with that initial cut, the transformation from intention to action, from unmarked stone to emerging form. Another strike followed, then another, and the rhythm established itself naturally, his body remembering what his mind didn't need to direct. The mallet's percussion and the chisel's bite created their patient music, and the lodge filled with the sound of work begun in earnest. William had completed his morning preparations and now stood at his own practice stone, following his master's example by beginning his own careful cuts. The boy's strikes came more slowly, with longer pauses between them, but Thomas noted the thoughtfulness in those pauses, the way William checked his angle and depth before each new cut. That carefulness would serve him well, would prevent the kind of rushed errors that wasted material and required difficult corrections. The morning unfolded with peaceful regularity, the work progressing through its natural stages. Thomas removed material systematically, following the marked lines, revealing the corbel's basic form. The first leaf began to emerge, its outline becoming visible as he carved away everything that was not part of the design. His hands moved with confidence born of countless repetitions, each strike placed exactly where it needed to be, each removal of stone bringing him closer to the finished piece. The sun climbed higher, its light shifting as it moved across the sky, and the shadows in the lodge rotated slowly with that movement. The warmth increased gradually, pleasant rather than uncomfortable, and Thomas felt his muscles loosen further with the combination of work and heat. Stone dust accumulated on his leather apron and his forearms, the fine powder settling into the fabric and onto his skin, adding to the permanent traces already present in the creases of his calloused hands. By the time the bells rang for terce, Thomas had completed the first leaf's basic form and had begun work on the second. He set down his tools and stepped back to examine his progress, his eyes tracing the curves he had created, checking that they matched the design he carried in his mind. Satisfied, he moved to the water bucket and washed his hands and face, the cool water refreshing after the concentrated effort of the past hours. William joined him, and they stood together looking out through the lodge's eastern opening at the cathedral rising before them. Work continued on the upper levels, and they could see other masons setting stones, spreading mortar, checking alignments with plumb lines and levels. The building grew incrementally, stone by stone, each day adding its small measure to the eventual whole. Thomas felt connected to that larger purpose, his own work in the lodge contributing to the cathedral's slow ascension toward completion. They returned to their respective tasks after the brief rest, and the morning continued its unhurried progression. Thomas worked through the second leaf, then began the third, his chisel following the marked guidelines with steady precision. The corbel gradually revealed its intended form, the 3 leaves taking shape in balanced arrangement around the capital's circumference. Each curve flowed naturally into the next, creating a harmony that would guide the eye upward along the arch the corbel would support. The stone accepted his tools willingly, its even grain making the work pleasant, presenting no hidden flaws or unexpected resistances. Thomas appreciated when stone cooperated in this way, when material and intention aligned without struggle. Some stones fought the carver, their grain running contrary to the desired cuts, their texture inconsistent, their color varying in ways that disrupted the design. But this limestone had come from a good portion of the quarry, its quality consistent throughout, and working it brought satisfaction rather than frustration. William had progressed to the point where his practice cuts showed genuine improvement, the edges cleaner, the depths more consistent. Thomas paused in his own work to observe the boy's technique, noting what had developed well and what still needed refinement. He moved to William's bench and placed his hand over the apprentice's, adjusting the angle slightly, showing through touch rather than words how the chisel should meet the stone. The boy nodded his understanding, and Thomas returned to his own work, trusting that the small correction would take root. The midday bells rang across the close, their voices marking the sun's highest point. Thomas and William set aside their tools and brought out the food Margaret had packed, bread and cheese, with the addition of apples from a basket William had brought from his family's small garden. They ate seated on their usual stones, the lodge's interior pleasantly warm now, the accumulated heat making rest welcome after the morning's physical effort. The bread was good, dense and satisfying, and the cheese had developed a sharpness that complemented it well. The apples provided sweetness and moisture, their juice refreshing in the warm afternoon. They ate without hurry, allowing their bodies to rest, their hands to recover from hours of gripping tools, their minds to drift from the focused attention carving required. Thomas watched a sparrow that had entered the lodge through one of the openings, the small bird hopping along the floor, pecking at scattered crumbs, completely at ease despite the human presence nearby. After the meal, Thomas did not immediately return to the corbel. Instead, he moved to examine the 2 completed pieces waiting in their protective boxes, checking that no damage had occurred during storage, ensuring they remained ready for installation. He lifted one of the corbels from its box, turning it slowly in his hands, examining it from all angles in the midday light. The carving held its quality, the leaves graceful and balanced, the surface smooth and even. He returned it carefully to its protective padding, satisfied that his work would serve its purpose well. The afternoon stretched ahead with hours of good light remaining, and Thomas returned to his current corbel with renewed focus. The basic forms of all 3 leaves were now complete, and he exchanged his heavier chisels for finer ones, tools designed for adding detail rather than removing bulk. He would add the veining next, those delicate lines that would give each leaf its particular character, suggesting the natural structure of foliage without attempting exact replication. The fine chisel required a lighter touch, barely more than scratching the limestone surface, and Thomas's hand adjusted automatically to the reduced force needed. He traced the first vein with careful attention, following the leaf's curve, branching it naturally as real leaves did, creating patterns that would catch light and cast subtle shadows. The work demanded concentration but felt meditative, each line flowing from the previous one in organic progression. William had returned to his practice stone, but Thomas noticed the boy glancing over occasionally, watching the detail work with interest. The apprentice had not yet progressed to carving veining. That skill would come later, after his hands had developed more control, after he had carved enough simple forms to understand how detail built upon foundation. But the observation itself had value, planting seeds of understanding that would bear fruit when the time came for William to attempt such work himself. The afternoon light slanted through the western opening now, its angle perfect for detail work, revealing every small ridge and depression in the stone's surface. Thomas worked with his face close to the corbel, his eyes tracking each line as it appeared, his hand moving with practiced certainty. The veining spread across the first leaf like water finding its path, natural and inevitable. And when that leaf was complete, he moved to the second, repeating the process with small variations that made each leaf individual. A breeze moved through the lodge, carrying the scent of the water meadows and bringing slight relief from the accumulated warmth. The air stirred the stone dust on the floor into small spirals that caught the afternoon light, creating brief patterns before settling again. Thomas paused to stretch his back, feeling the pleasant ache that came from hours bent over his work, then returned to the carving with the same patient attention he had maintained throughout the day. The third leaf received its veining as the afternoon progressed toward evening, and when Thomas finally set down his chisel and stepped back to examine the completed detail work, he felt the quiet satisfaction of having achieved exactly what he had intended. The three leaves now showed their full character, the veining giving them depth and life, the whole composition balanced and harmonious. Tomorrow he would begin the smoothing and polishing, but today's work was complete. William had finished his own practice and had already begun the evening tasks, covering the stones with dampened cloth, organizing tools, sweeping the accumulated dust. Thomas joined him in these preparations, and together they readied the lodge for night. The completed corbel received careful covering to protect its detailed surface, and Thomas made notes in his mind about which rasps he would need in the morning, which polishing stones would bring the best finish to this particular limestone. They secured the shutters and barred the door as the sun settled lower in the western sky. The cathedral's walls glowed warmly in the horizontal light, and the shadows had grown long enough to merge into continuous pools of shade. Other craftsmen descended from their various workplaces, their day's labor complete, and the close began to fill with the sounds of departure, voices calling farewells, tools being secured, footsteps on worn paths. Thomas and William walked together through the familiar evening landscape, the town showing its end-of-day character. Smoke rose from chimneys where evening meals were being prepared, and the scent of cooking filled the air, onions and herbs, bread warming by hearths, the savory smell of pottage simmering. Children played in the streets, their voices bright with the energy that came at day's end, and their laughter added to the town's peaceful atmosphere. They parted at the usual place, and Thomas continued toward home alone. His body carried the comfortable fatigue of honest work. His hands bore fresh traces of limestone dust, and his mind held the image of the corbel taking shape under his tools. The day had been good, work progressing well, William learning steadily, the cathedral growing stone by stone. These satisfactions accumulated into contentment, into the sense that his life followed its proper path. Margaret, 41 years old, with capable hands marked by years of household work and brown hair threaded with silver strands, looked up from the hearth as he entered. She had been stirring the evening's pottage, and the steam rising from the pot carried familiar scents: turnips and onions, barley and a small amount of salted pork, herbs from her garden. She smiled at his arrival, setting aside the wooden spoon to pour ale into his cup, and he settled onto his bench with a grateful sigh. The fire burned warmly, casting its comfortable glow across the room, and Thomas felt the day's tension begin to ease from his shoulders. Margaret returned to her cooking, moving through the space with practiced efficiency, and he watched her capable hands perform their tasks with the same skill his own hands brought to stone. The room held the accumulated warmth of the day and the cooking fire, creating a coziness that wrapped around him like a familiar embrace. She ladled pottage into their bowls when it had cooked sufficiently, the thick stew steaming and fragrant. They ate together at the table, sharing the simple meal, speaking occasionally of their respective days but mostly content with companionable silence. The pottage satisfied deeply, warming him from within, replenishing the energy the day's work had consumed. Margaret had baked fresh bread that afternoon, and its crust crackled pleasantly when he broke it, the interior soft and warm. After the meal, Margaret cleared the bowls and set them to soak while Thomas remained at the table, his hands wrapped around a second cup of ale. The evening had settled fully now, darkness gathering outside the windows, the familiar transition from day to night occurring in its eternal pattern. Margaret lit the rushlight from the cooking fire, and its small flame cast gentle illumination across the room, creating shadows that swayed slightly with the movement of air. She settled onto the bench beside him with her spinning, her capable hands finding their rhythm with the spindle and wool. The motion was soothing to watch, the fiber twisting into thread, the spindle turning in its patient rotation. Thomas felt deeply grateful for this partnership, for the life they had built together through years of mutual care and shared purpose. Her presence required nothing from him, yet gave everything: comfort, companionship, the peace of being fully known and accepted. The spindle hummed softly as it turned, and Margaret's hands moved with the unconscious grace that came from years of repetition. Thomas watched the thread grow longer, watched her fingers maintain exactly the right tension to create even thickness throughout. The skill in her work matched the skill in his own, though their materials and methods differed. Both required patience, both demanded attention, both transformed raw material into something useful and enduring. The fire burned steadily, its flames dancing across the logs Thomas had added after the meal. The light played across the rafters overhead, creating shifting patterns that held a gentle fascination. Outside, the sounds of the town settling for night carried through the walls, shutters closing, voices calling final greetings, dogs barking in their yards, the distant lowing of cattle being secured for the evening. These familiar sounds wove together into the texture of nightfall, reassuring in their predictability. Thomas rose eventually and moved to add another log to the fire, ensuring it would provide warmth through the cool hours ahead. The wood caught quickly, flames licking up around it, releasing the scent of oak and a brief shower of sparks that rose toward the smoke hole. He stood for a moment watching the fire, his mind drifting through thoughts of the corbel waiting in the lodge, of tomorrow's smoothing and polishing, of William's steady improvement, of the cathedral's patient rise. Margaret finished the wool she had been spinning and set the spindle aside. She moved to the basin where the bowls soaked, washing them with careful attention before drying them and returning them to their shelf. Each evening task flowed naturally into the next, creating a sequence that prepared the household for rest. Thomas watched her work, appreciating the care she brought to even the smallest duties, the way she maintained their home with the same thoroughness he brought to his carving. She banked the cooking fire for the night, covering the coals with ash so they would hold until morning, ready to be revived without requiring new flame. The fire in the main hearth she left burning lower but not extinguished, enough to keep the room comfortable through the night. The rushlight flickered on the wall, and by its glow they moved through the familiar preparations for sleep. Thomas checked the door's bar and the shutter's latches, ensuring the house was properly secured. Margaret spread the sleeping pallet near the hearth, arranging the wool blankets that would keep them warm through the cool hours. The bed welcomed them with its familiar comfort, the straw-filled ticking settling beneath their weight, the linen covering soft against their skin. They lay down together, and Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands and graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, felt the day's labor transform into the deep satisfaction that preceded sleep. His body relaxed into the pallet's support, his muscles releasing their held tension, his breathing beginning to slow and deepen. Margaret's presence beside him provided warmth and companionship, and he felt grateful once more for the life they shared. The fire's glow played across the ceiling, creating gentle patterns that shifted with the flame's movement. Thomas watched them without particular focus, his mind beginning to release its hold on conscious thought, drifting toward the peace that would carry him into sleep. His hands rested on his chest, bearing their permanent traces of limestone dust, holding no tension, requiring no purpose beyond simply being at rest. Margaret's breathing had already begun to deepen, her body surrendering to sleep with the ease of someone whose day had been spent in honest work, whose conscience held no troubles. Thomas listened to that familiar rhythm, finding in it a meditation that drew him closer to his own rest. The room held them gently, the walls providing shelter, the fire offering warmth, the darkness creating a space where consciousness could safely withdraw. His thoughts grew more fragmented as sleep approached, images of carved leaves, the sound of chisel on stone, William's eager face, Margaret's hand spinning thread, the cathedral rising against the sky. These images floated through his awareness without urgency or connection, simply passing through like clouds across a peaceful sky. His breathing slowed further, matching Margaret's, and the boundary between waking and sleeping grew thinner. The rushlight burned lower, its oil diminishing, its flame growing smaller. Thomas watched it with decreasing attention, his eyelids growing heavy, his body sinking deeper into the pallet's comfort. The warmth from the fire and the blankets wrapped around him completely, creating a cocoon of security and peace. His last conscious awareness was of gratitude for the day's good work, for Margaret's presence, for the simple sufficiency of their life together, for the privilege of contributing his small measure to something that would endure beyond his own years. Sleep came gently, not as a sudden loss of consciousness, but as a gradual deepening of rest, awareness fatting degree by degree until it released entirely. His breathing became perfectly even, his body utterly relaxed, his face peaceful in repose. The day that had begun with dawn's first light, that had progressed through hours of patient labor, that had included simple meals and quiet companionship, now ended in the profound rest that prepared him for tomorrow's continuation of the same blessed pattern. The fire burned on, its flames smaller now but steady, casting their gentle light across two sleeping forms. The house stood solid around them, timber and thatch fulfilling their purpose of shelter. Outside, the night deepened, the stars emerged in their ancient patterns, and the town settled into collective rest. The cathedral waited in darkness, its unfinished walls patient and permanent, ready for tomorrow's hands to add their measure to its slow growth. In the lodge, the corbel rested under its protective cloth, 3 leaves carved and detailed, waiting for the final smoothing that would complete its transformation from quarried stone to sacred architecture. Everything waited in stillness. The sleeping town, the rising cathedral, Thomas and Margaret in their peaceful rest. The whole world suspended in the gentle space between one day's ending and another's beginning. The night held all of this in its quiet hands, asking nothing, simply being, while sleep restored what work had spent and darkness prepared the way for light's return. The night held its deepest quiet, that hour when sleep reached its most profound depth, and the world seemed suspended in perfect stillness. Thomas remained in rest's embrace, his breathing so slow, and even it seemed part of the darkness itself. His body had found complete restoration through the hours of sleep, muscles replenished, strength renewed, ready for the day that would eventually come but had not yet begun to announce itself. Margaret slept beside him with the same depth, her brown hair threaded with silver strands spread across the pillow, her capable hands marked by years of household work resting quietly on the blanket. The years of sharing this space had created a harmony that extended into sleep, their breathing synchronized without intention, their presence together creating a completeness that required no acknowledgement to be felt. The fire had burned down to its faintest glow, barely visible now, just the smallest pulse of red beneath the accumulated ash. Yet its warmth persisted, radiating gently into the room, keeping the air comfortable despite the night's coolness. The wool blankets held that warmth close, creating a small climate of perfect comfort where Thomas and Margaret rested undisturbed. Outside, the stars continued their patient wheel across the sky, their positions shifted measurably from earlier in the night. The constellations had rotated through their ancient patterns, marking time's passage in the way they had for countless centuries, indifferent to human sleep or waking. The town below remained wrapped in collective rest, every household dark and quiet, every street empty and still. In the cathedral close, the great church stood in patient silence, its unfinished walls rising dark against the starlit sky. The scaffolding clung to its sides, empty of the hands that would return with morning, and the whole structure waited with the same stillness it had maintained throughout the night. Inside the lodge, the corbel rested under its protective cloth, 3 leaves carved and detailed, waiting for Thomas's hands to complete the final smoothing and polishing that would transform it from good work into finished beauty. The water meadows beyond the town held their own quiet, the grass bent with dew that had formed as the earth cooled. Each blade caught starlight in tiny droplets, creating countless points of reflected brightness scattered across the dark ground. The river moved through its channel with constant murmur, a sound so steady it became part of the silence rather than a break from it, and its surface occasionally caught light from the sky, briefly shimmering before returning to darkness. Thomas's hands lay still on his chest, the stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused palms, invisible in the darkness but permanently present, the testament to years of patient labor. His fingers remained naturally curved, holding no tension, bearing no burden, simply existing in their own peaceful stillness. The strength that lived in those hands during waking hours had released itself completely now, surrendered to sleep's restoration. His face in repose showed the peace that came with complete release from consciousness. His features relaxed, no lines of concern around his eyes or mouth. His graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord rested against the pillow, and his breathing moved through him like a gentle tide, requiring nothing, asking nothing, simply continuing in its patient rhythm. The sleep that held him had reached its fullest measure, the restoration nearly complete, though consciousness remained distant still. The house around them had settled into its coolest point, that hour when the previous day's warmth had fully dissipated and the new day's heat had not yet begun to gather. The timber frame and thatch roof fulfilled their purpose of shelter without sound or notice, keeping the interior protected from the night's chill while allowing air to circulate naturally. Everything in the structure worked together in silent cooperation, walls supporting roof, foundations supporting walls, each element performing its role in the quiet conspiracy of home. Margaret stirred slightly in her sleep, a small movement that brought her closer to Thomas's warmth, though neither of them woke. Her body adjusted itself naturally and settled again into stillness, her breathing resuming its even pace after the brief interruption. These small adjustments were part of sleep's natural pattern, the body maintaining comfort through the long hours of rest without requiring conscious guidance. The darkness in the room remained complete, the fire's glow too faint now to illuminate anything, the shutters keeping out whatever changes might be occurring in the sky beyond. But outside, the very quality of night had begun its subtle shift, the first imperceptible movement toward the transformation that would eventually bring dawn. The change existed more in the air itself than in any visible sign, a tension that spoke of approaching transition, though darkness still held complete dominion. In distant yards throughout the town, roosters began to stir on their perches, sensing what human sleepers could not yet perceive. They remained quiet still, not yet ready to announce the coming day, but their bodies had begun to wake, preparing for the calls they would soon send across the rooftops. A few early birds in the trees that bordered the close began their own quiet stirrings, shifting position on their branches, ruffling feathers, readying themselves for dawn's arrival. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands and graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, remained deep in sleep's embrace despite these first subtle signs of approaching morning. His body had not yet begun its transition back toward waking, still drawing the last measures of restoration from the night's depth. His breathing continued its slow rhythm, unchanged, his face peaceful, his hands still, everything at rest. The stars overhead had begun their gradual fade, though they remained visible still, bright points against the darkness. The eastern horizon held the first hint of change, not light exactly, but a barely perceptible lessening of absolute blackness, a suggestion that somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, the sun had begun its own preparation for rising. The hills showed as slightly darker shapes against a sky that had become merely dark rather than infinite. Margaret's sleep had begun to lighten slightly, her body responding to signals too subtle for conscious awareness to detect. Her breathing changed rhythm imperceptibly, becoming less deep, more variable, though she remained fully asleep. The household's morning tasks waited in that quiet way that duty always did, and some part of her awareness had begun to acknowledge their approach, preparing for the transition from rest to waking that would come soon but had not yet arrived. The night continued its slow progression toward dawn, the change gradual enough that each moment seemed unchanged from the one before. The darkness remained profound, but something in its quality had shifted, becoming less solid, less absolute. The air itself seemed to hold differently, to carry within it the whisper of approaching transformation, though no visible evidence yet supported that sense. Thomas's sleep remained deep and undisturbed, his body drawing the final measures of restoration from the night's remaining hours. His breathing continued its patient rhythm, his face peaceful in repose, his hands resting quietly on his chest. The stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused palms remained invisible in the darkness, but it stayed there as it always did, the permanent mark of work that shaped his days and gave his life its structure and meaning. The fire in the hearth had dimmed to almost nothing now, just the faintest pulse of warmth remaining in the buried coals. Yet that small heat persisted faithfully, waiting to be revived when morning came, holding itself in readiness for Margaret's practiced hands to uncover and rebuild it into flame. The room had grown cooler with this deepest hour, but the wool blankets continued their patient work, holding warmth close, keeping Thomas and Margaret comfortable in their shared rest. Outside, the first rooster finally lifted its head and released its call, the sound cutting through the silence with sudden clarity. The crow carried across the dark town, announcing what eyes could not yet see, that the night had reached its turning point, that the slow wheel toward morning had begun in earnest. Other roosters answered from their own yards, and soon a chorus of calls spread through the streets, each bird adding its voice to the proclamation, though darkness still held its claim on the visible world. Margaret's eyes opened slowly, her body responding to the rooster's calls and to the internal knowledge that morning approached. She lay still for a moment, oriented herself in the familiar darkness, felt Thomas's continued deep breathing beside her. The day's tasks called to her in their quiet way, Fire to revive, water to heat, the household to prepare for another day's rhythm. She moved carefully, not wanting to disturb Thomas's rest, sliding from beneath the blankets with the practiced ease of years. The floor felt cool beneath her feet as she stood, and she reached for the shawl that hung nearby, wrapping it around her shoulders against the morning chill. Her capable hands, marked by years of household work, found what they needed even in the darkness: the poker for the hearth, the basket of kindling kept ready, the flint and steel if the coals required it. She moved to the hearth and knelt before it, her movements quiet and efficient. She pushed aside the ash that covered the banked coals, and a faint glow rewarded her careful uncovering. The coals had held through the night as she had known they would, and she added small pieces of kindling, positioning them to catch without smothering the heat. She blew gently on the embers, her breath coaxing them back to life, and the kindling began to smoke, then caught with small flames that grew quickly, casting the first light into the room since the rushlight had burned out hours before. Margaret added larger pieces of wood, building the fire with the care that ensured it would burn cleanly and provide the heat she needed. The flames rose bright and warm, pushing back the darkness and the chill, and soon the familiar glow filled the room, revealing the space in flickering detail. She moved to the water bucket and poured water into the pot, hanging it from the crane over the fire to heat for washing and for the morning's porridge. The fire's warmth and light began to reach the place where Thomas slept, and his body responded to these signals, beginning its slow journey back toward consciousness. His breathing changed rhythm slightly, becoming less deep, more variable, as sleep's hold gradually loosened. His eyes remained closed, but his awareness had started its return, bringing with it the gradual recognition of morning's arrival, of the bed beneath him, of Margaret's quiet movements preparing the household for the day. He lay still for a moment longer, allowing the transition to complete itself naturally, not rushing the passage from sleep to waking. His body felt restored, the night's rest having done its work completely. His muscles held no ache from the previous day's labor. His mind felt clear and ready for the work ahead. He opened his eyes finally, seeing the familiar rafters above him lit by firelight, and felt the quiet satisfaction of having slept well, of waking naturally to another day's beginning. Thomas sat up slowly, his body taking its time to adjust, and he ran his hands through his graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, checking that it remained secure. Margaret glanced over at him and offered a small smile, the quiet acknowledgement of another morning begun together. She had set bread slices near the fire to toast, and their scent had begun to fill the room, mingling with wood smoke and the heating water. He rose from the pallet and moved to the basin where he could wash before the day's work began. The water Margaret had set aside felt cool and clarifying against his skin, washing away the last traces of sleep. He dried himself with the linen cloth and moved to dress in his work tunic and braize, pulling on the leather apron that bore the permanent marks of his trade: pale streaks of limestone dust, darker stains from dampened stone, small burns from tools heated in the forge. Margaret had prepared porridge from oats, and she ladled it into their bowls, adding a small amount of honey. The sweetness would give them energy for the morning ahead. They sat together at the table, the toasted bread between them, and ate without hurry. Through the shutters came evidence of dawn's true approach. Not full light yet, but a definite lessening of darkness. a sense that the world outside was revealing itself degree by degree. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands, ate the porridge slowly, appreciating its warmth and substance. Margaret had cooked it perfectly, the oats soft but retaining texture, the honey providing sweetness without overwhelming the grain's natural flavor. He tore pieces of toasted bread and dipped them in the porridge, the combination familiar and satisfying, preparing him for the work that waited at the lodge. They spoke little during the meal, both naturally quiet in the early morning, content with companionship that required no words. When they had finished, Margaret cleared the bowls and Thomas gathered his tools, his leather apron already worn, the small bag containing his personal chisels, the cloth-wrapped bundle of bread and cheese for midday that Margaret handed him. She had packed enough for both him and William, as she always did, knowing the apprentice's family sometimes struggled to provide adequate provisions. Thomas opened the door onto a world transformed by the approaching dawn. The darkness had retreated significantly, and though the sun had not yet appeared above the horizon, the sky showed clear gradations of color, deep blue overhead fading to lighter shades near the east, where a band of pale gold announced the sun's imminent arrival. The stars had faded except for the very brightest, and the whole world seemed poised in that moment of transition, balanced between night and day. Thomas stepped out into the cool morning air, and Margaret stood in the doorway watching him go as she did each morning. He turned back once to raise his hand in farewell, and she returned the gesture before stepping inside. The path before him showed clearly now in the growing light, familiar and well-worn, leading him toward the cathedral close and the work that waited there. Other craftsmen had begun to emerge from their houses, moving along various paths toward their own labors. Thomas exchanged nods with those he passed, wordless greetings that acknowledged shared purpose and the early hour. The town was waking gradually, smoke rising from chimneys, shutters opening, the sounds of morning beginning to fill the streets, a dog's bark, a cart's creak, voices calling greetings. The cathedral close opened before him as he rounded the final corner, and he paused to take in the sight that never failed to move him. The great church rose against the lightening sky, its walls substantial and purposeful, its incomplete height promising even greater majesty when the work finally reached completion. The scaffolding showed clearly now, and other masons were already climbing toward their positions, early risers beginning their day's contribution to the building's patient growth. Thomas walked toward the lodge, his boots making soft sounds on the packed earth. The door stood where he had left it, securely barred, and he lifted the latch and pushed it open. The interior still held traces of yesterday's work. Limestone dust settled on surfaces, the faint mineral scent of stone, the covered corbel waiting on its bench. He opened the shutters systematically, allowing the morning's cool air and growing light to flood the space. The corbel called to him with its near completion. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands and graying brown hair tied back with a leather cord, removed the protective cloth and ran his palm across the carved surface. The 3 leaves showed their detail beautifully, the veining catching the early light, creating exactly the play of shadow and brightness he had intended. Today he would complete the smoothing and polishing, would bring this piece to its finished state. He lit the small fire in the brazier, more for the comfort of its presence than necessity, and began arranging his tools, the rasps first, then the polishing stones, everything in the sequence he would need. The morning light continued to strengthen, streaming through the eastern opening, illuminating his workspace with perfect clarity. He positioned himself at the bench, his body finding its familiar stance, and selected the first rasp. The sun broke above the horizon as he made the first stroke across the stone's surface, its rays flooding the lodge with golden light. The rasp whispered against the limestone, beginning the patient work of smoothing, of refining what the chisels had created. Thomas fell into the meditation of repetitive motion, his breathing synchronized with the rhythm of his hands, and the morning unfolded with the same peaceful regularity that had marked all the days before it. William arrived as the sun climbed higher, the boy's face eager despite the early hour, and he moved immediately to his tasks, filling water buckets, preparing materials, beginning his own practice work. The lodge filled with the sounds of their shared labor, and Thomas felt the deep contentment that came from work done with care, from skills applied with patience, from contributing his measure to something that would endure. Hours passed in this way, the rasping giving way to polishing, the stone's surface growing smoother and more lustrous with each circular pass of the dampened polishing stone. Thomas worked without hurry, knowing that rushing would undo all the careful attention that had come before. The corbel revealed its truest character under his hands, the cream-colored limestone glowing softly, the carved leaves holding their graceful curves, the whole piece balanced and complete. By midday, when the bells rang across the close, Thomas set down his polishing stone and stepped back to examine the finished work. The corbel sat on the bench, its surface smooth and even, its details crisp and clear, ready to take its place high in the cathedral's south transept. He felt the quiet satisfaction that always came with completion, with having transformed rough quarried stone into something beautiful and purposeful through patient attention and skill passed down through generations. He and William ate their midday meal in comfortable silence, seated on their usual stones, the lodge warm with accumulated sunlight. After eating, Thomas carefully lifted the completed corbel and placed it in its protective box alongside the others he had finished. 3 pieces now waited for the master mason's inspection. 3 contributions to the cathedral's slow rise, 3 expressions of the craft that gave his life its meaning and structure. The afternoon stretched ahead with new work waiting, another stone marked and ready, more leaves to carve, more patient hours of shaping resistant material into forms of grace. But for this moment, Thomas simply stood in the lodge's doorway, looking out at the cathedral rising before him, feeling the sun's warmth on his face, listening to the sounds of other masons at their work, grateful for the privilege of contributing his hands and his skill to something greater than himself. The light fell golden across the cathedral's pale stone, and a breeze moved through the close, carrying the scent of the water meadows and the promise of another peaceful day's labor. Thomas, 38 years old, with stone dust permanently settled into the creases of his calloused hands, turned back to his bench where new stone waited, ready to begin again, ready to continue the work that would go on long after his own hands had stilled, adding stone to stone, day to day, patient and purposeful and enduring as the cathedral itself.